kann euch zu Weihnachten nichts geben. Ich kann euch für den Christbaum, wenn ihr überhaupt einen habt,
I can give you nothing for Christmas. I cannot give you candles for your Christmas tree, if you even have one. I cannot give you bread. I cannot give you coal to heat. I cannot give you glass for your windows. We have nothing. However, I ask of you, believe in this Austria.
In December 1945, at the time of this quote, Leopold Figl had just been elected as the first Chancellor of the Second Austrian Republic of the post-World War II era. Austria was currently split up into 4 areas of occupation, each controlled by one of the 4 Allied powers of England, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. Austrians were desperate, and Figl recognized the danger such desperation could pose for the future of Austria. This quote from Figl's Christmas address, less than a month after his election as Chancellor, represents his will to pull Austrian citizens together and form a strong belief that Austria would stay a united country. Leopold Figl's charming personality and fearless action as a leader gave him the characteristics that post-war Austria needed to transform under the real threat of permanent communist occupation and the division of the country. Figl leaves the legacies of a free and unified Austrian Republic and Austrian neutrality. Before the Second World War, Austria was a deeply divided country, with no unified national army. Political parties from the Christian conservatives, the socialists, to the communists were forming paramilitary and cultural organizations. During this period, Figl was already an experienced politician and leader in the Lower Austria of the Bauerbund, or Peasant Union Party, a form of Christian social conservatism, and their paramilitary and cultural branch, the Ostmarkische Sturmschan. Figl was a staunch patriot who opposed the rising Nazi party within Austria and resisted the annexation of Austria into the German Reich. In 1938, hours into the German annexation of Austria, the Gestapo arrested Figl and he was sent to Dachau, where he suffered the horrors of the Nazi concentration camp for 5 years. He was briefly released in 1943, then rearrested and interned at Mauthausen concentration camp, and eventually Vienna's central prison, where he was awaiting execution for treason at the end of the war. Brooke Shefford claims that Austria's pre-war ideological rifts were healed in Hitler's concentration camps. The present being unbearable, they talked about the future, and that meant burying the past.
Was hat Figl hinterlassen? Was ist sein Vermächtnis für Österreich?
Figl war ein Patriot. Ja? Figl war ein Patriot, der hat alles für Österreich getan. Er ist ja 1938 schon nach Dachau gekommen. Da war er vor 5 Jahren in KZ, dann ist er zurückgekommen, hat sich aber wieder für die Bauern eingesetzt und auch Politik gemacht, und so ist er nach dem Hitler-Attentat nochmal verhaftet worden, da im Juni 1944 war das. Ne? Und da war er dann in Mauthausen. Mauthausen ist in Wien ins Landesgericht überstellt worden, da ist ihm der Prozess gemacht im Jänner und da wurde er zum Tode verurteilt. Und da war er dann von Jänner bis April in der Todeszelle in Wien im Landesgericht, bis die Russen einmarschiert sind.
This meant that Figl's views became focused not only on the well-being of a specific region or one group of people, but instead on the whole of Austria, which made him the leader that post-war Austria so desperately needed. In the year immediately following the end of the war, there was a large reorganizing effort of the major pre-war Austrian political parties. Figl's former Peasant Union and other Christian conservatives reorganized under the name of the Austrian People's Party. In April 1945, the 3 largest parties, the Social Democrats, the Austrian People's Party, and the Communists, formed a provisional government. Initially, the Communists emerged as a major political force, mainly because of the Soviet occupation in eastern Austria. However, the first free elections were held on November 1945, with Figl's party, the Austrian People's Party, coming in at just over 50% of the vote, the Social Democrats with 44%, and the Communists with only 5% of the votes. This had largely to do with the Austrian people's desire for reconciliation after the Nazi era, and the Communists' strong anti-fascist message, which seemed to include anyone who did not agree with their political message. Figl headed this first freely elected government as Chancellor, and he formed a coalition government, even inviting the defeated Communists into the government, partially to appease the Soviets and partially to show the importance of Austrian unity over political parties. This precedent has an enduring legacy in Austrian politics, with coalition sharing of cabinet positions still in practice today.
Da hat ja die absolute Mehrheit gekriegt in 1945. Ne? Und die waren die Russen, die waren ja ganz enttäuscht, weil sie glaubt haben, die Kommunisten haben die Mehrheit. Ne? Und das hat aber, der Figl hat das geschaffen. Ja.
Waren die da?
In Anfang waren es schlimm, die ersten Monate, was gekommen sind. Da waren es schlimm, ja. Die Frauen haben sich dann verstecken müssen und sie haben alles mitgenommen, was nicht.
From 1945 to 1953, Leopold Figl led Austria as Chancellor. During this time, Austria's future remained in question. The Cold War had begun, and the East-West conflict stood in the way of a general reconciliation in Europe. Under these circumstances, Figl had to find a way to govern without tipping Austria too far to the east or too far to the west, thus provoking a conflict between the two world players with Austria as their battleground. Initially, the Western Allies, the United States in particular, were suspicious of the Provisional Austrian government, which was formed without their influence. The election of Figl to head of government helped change the Western Allies' opinions. Figl, due to his imprisonment during the Nazi occupation, was beyond the suspicion of fascism. The Soviets feared the possibility of Austria joining in the rapidly forming post-war NATO alliance. Although Figl and the majority of Austrians had opinions which were more favorable to the Western Allies, Figl was always aware that Austria was still divided under the Allied forces, and that any move toward the West jeopardized the security of Soviet-occupied areas. Brooke Shefford attributes his success in managing the Allied forces to his charm, which he, quote, exerted in subtly different ways on each of the contrasting Allied commanders who succeeded one another as his political masters. One of Figl's most defining moments as a leader was when he showed his integrity and fearlessness by telling a yelling Soviet general to watch his tone of voice when talking to the Federal Chancellor of Austria. These examples show how his personality and character convinced the people of Austria and the four Allied powers that he was the most suitable leader to transform and point Austria in the right direction for success.
Wien, Niederösterreich und Burgenland hätte gehört zum Osten, ja? Und das andere zum Westen. Und der Figl ist aufgestanden und gesagt, entweder ganz Österreich oder gar nicht.
In 1953, when Figl resigned as Austrian Chancellor, Austria was still divided into four zones, each overseen by one of the occupational forces. In 1949, Germany had effectively split into two countries, and it looked the same would happen to Austria. Figl became foreign minister several months after resigning as chancellor, and in the wake of Stalin's death in March of 1953, began negotiating with Soviet commanders for a peace treaty. With Figl heading the Austrian delegation, the Soviets offered to give Austria full authority and to withdraw from the Soviet administration. In return, they wanted to maintain a presence of 5,000 men in Austria. Roman states that Figl rejected this occupying force, though he was willing to pledge his country's permanent neutrality.
Bewusst und ich habe auch Leopold Figl sehr gut bekannt. Der Figl war ein ganz guter Freund zu meinem Vater. Und durch das mir mein Onkel gesagt zu ihm. Mein Vater hat gesagt, ein richtiger Frauenschädel. Er hat sich was eingebracht und das hat er durchgeführt. Ja?
The American Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, pushed Figl not to offer military neutrality to the Russians. Figl saw this as his only chance to keep Austria undivided. Neutrality was to be a key piece of leverage in the battle for Austrian independence. After more than a year of negotiation, in spring of 1955, the Soviets and Austrians concluded their negotiations for a peace treaty. In June of 1955, the Austrian parliament ratified it unanimously and declared Austria's internal neutrality. Figl's main goal as chancellor and in foreign policy had been achieved, to preserve the unity of Austria. Leopold Figl's legacies of an independent Austrian republic and Austrian neutrality are still present and affect Austrians every day. Austria celebrates October the 26th of 1956, the day the last Allied soldier left Austria, as a national holiday. This means that every year Austria takes a day to remember Figl's legacy. Even decades after Figl's death, Austria is still ruled by coalitions of political parties by consensus in a democratic system. As Figl himself stated on May 15th of 1955, after signing the State Treaty of the re-establishment of an independent and democratic Austria, Österreich ist frei.